Let's talk a little about water. How does it work? So here we are in a city that has hills, and so of course there are going to be low places. As a bicyclist, this is kind of what got me into studying water, is being a bicyclist for everyday transportation, and I realized I'm following the same routes the water would have followed because I'm trying to avoid the hills too. The water it essentially avoids the hills by flowing in the low spots. And the way that it works, of course, is it soaks in the hills. The water table in the hills is higher. It makes its way sideways to wherever it can come out of the ground and show up as a flow, creek or a pond or something like that. So this is a diagram by Emily Underwood, a nice illustrator and artist that I've worked with for many, many years, who does a lot of natural history kinds of things. And I love the way she included in these plants along the creek because, of course, that's where the soil can be dry sometimes and have still, the roots will always have a freshwater supply. And this is what it looks like in the big picture. These tan, yellowish fans of debris that have washed out of the gullies and into the flatlands are called alluvial fans. Alluvium is the stuff that washes out, that the creek washes out of the hills. Now this is actually a pretty close analog to what has happened in San Francisco at all the edges of San Francisco. The hills have almost always, in almost every case, there are flatlands between the hills and the bay, or between the hills and the ocean. So this is approximately how it all forms. The one place where that is not the case is Black Point, where the bedrock goes crashing straight down into the sea, and the water was deep enough for ships to anchor there before any of the land terraforming, I guess you would call it, before any of the changes were made by humans sculpting the place. Now at a fine detail level, this is what we have. We have the water soaking in. And now in this drawing, Emily put brown as kind of a hint of where clay would be, and it's just gives you an idea of how overlaying soils, some of them are impermeable. You have these arrows to the side. Oh, a little bit of feedback here. Have arrows to the side showing that that when it hits clay, when the water is percolating through the soil and it hits clay, it'll probably go to the sides instead of straight in, because clay is a barrier. Clay has flat particles that act like they overlap, and they act like shingles, and they prevent water from flowing through as well. But it does get past and down into the water table. Now we'll compare side by side that thing that's happening here with what happens in places that have limestone or other formations where the bedrock dissolves. It might be the caves in Santa Cruz that you see there. The limestone in Santa Cruz. On the other side of the San Andreas Fault, there's quite a bit of limestone. So you'd have to go down southwest of here to get to it. Or in the Ozarks, there are lots of places, and the formations are named after the karst, limestone karst. It's named after a province in Eastern Europe that has lots and lots of limestone. Those are places where you really have water flowing underground. You could call it an underground creek or an underground river or something like that. If you hear people saying, well, let's just put it this way. If I hear people saying underground creeks in San Francisco, I stop them. I say, wait a minute, no. We don't have underground creeks. We don't have hidden creeks. We have water percolating through the soil, seeping through the soil, prodigious amounts of water moving through the soil, but not underground creeks. Because once you fill in a creek, it's like putting in a dam. It's like putting in a dam, but it's not just a part of the creek. The whole creek is dammed. It just suddenly changes into water percolating through the soil. And this is the only kind of underground creek that we have, the sewers. So yes, there's water flowing under us, and some of it is in the locations where creeks used to flow. but now just raccoons and empty bottles. And, and the water in the sewer flow through there. Oh, and of course, those plants by the side of the creek are also joined by fungus by the sides of the creek, or in the places where the water, where it gets wet in the winter. There's some strange guy looking at some amanita mushrooms in McLaren Park that come up every time it rains. So there's all kinds of growth that happens along the waterways. This is along what used to be Yosemite Creek, although it's been diverted into various ditches, and this is one of the ditches. So let's get to where we are now. Those of us physically in the room are located in a spot that would be on this map, would be right here, where these buildings are. If you look closely, this is the shoreline of Yerba Buena Cove, and Yerba Buena Cove was filled in early. A lot of other coves and bays were filled in San Francisco, but because of the gold rush ships and various needs for anchorage in deeper water, it was filled in early. And this drawing has both the creek that went past this spot, which you can see right here, and another creek which was, there we go, which flowed out here along Jackson Street. And both of those creeks had significant amounts of water that would form pools right where they entered the bay. In the case of the one you see on the right, it was a saltwater pool because usually a saltwater pool because the bay would come in at high tide. And on the left was a freshwater pool in the sand, and it would change around with the weather and the tides and so on. But there are documents describing people swimming in it, and it's a little bit under-documented because of the fact that people were busy doing other things. People came here for other reasons than to draw maps. Hardly anybody was interested in drawing maps of this area. In fact, this map was drawn long after the fact. It's what's called a memory map, drawing from memory after the fact. Well, people were drawing maps all right, but they were drawing maps of the gold country and not focusing so much on what was right here below their feet. And I'm sort of sad that there aren't any people like me who were seriously curious about the water and documenting that water then. But we have a few little hints here and there. This is a map from 1851 or 1852 that was overlaid by a guy named Alan Zimmerman onto the hills in like a 3D model. And you can see the Telegraph Hill here on the right-hand side. This is North Point up here. And this is Yerba Buena Cove being filled in by 1852. Those black areas are places that were built up with buildings. And if we get Alan's magic to work here, we'll see exactly what happens when it rains. So the rain comes down and it fills in the gullies and it flows to the bay, and you can see the lines here. I'll do that again. You can see the lines that were the flow areas. Now, this is based on what the landform is. It's not based on the reality of what humans have done to the landform, even though, yes, you see those houses in there and those buildings in there. Those aren't calculated in. And remember, some of those people in some of those buildings were purposely preventing this water from flowing down to these gullies because they wanted to trap it and sell it. That was one of the main things people were excited to do when they came to San Francisco, was sell each other things. Anything they could find to sell each other, they would. And the pricing was always dependent on which ships had just arrived. So this is the Dugal drawing that I had shown at the beginning, and you can see Yerba Buena Cove in this area between Telegraph Hill, which in this drawing is called Signal Hill, and Rincon Point on the left. which is labeled Rincon Point, and the hills of San Francisco behind, the small town of Yerba Buena, which at the moment this was being drawn was being renamed San Francisco. Well, not at the very moment, but had just been renamed 4 years earlier. And the ships filling up the harbor there. Now, this is the first official map that was done. This is Eddie's map, and you can see on this map the little tidal lagoon here at the north end of Yerba Buena Cove and at Jackson Street, and nothing was drawn where our neighbor half a block away, the creek that was right here, flowed into the bay. But there is a Spring Street still there today. So you can kind of see remnants in the landscape that show where things were and give you a little hint. This is, I think I have to zoom out before I go to the next slide. There we go. So this is a drawing from Vancouver's expedition. When George Vancouver came into San Francisco in the 1792, he drew what he did see of the coastline, which wasn't all of the bay. That's why it stops suddenly. There's Yerba Buena Island, which is now, of course, joined by a big area of bay fill, a Treasure Island just north of it. But directly onshore, you can see these two ponds that I was talking about. The pond that's the saltwater lagoon and the pond that's the freshwater lagoon in Yerba Buena Cove. This little anchor here is where Vancouver anchored his ship until he was invited by the Commandante to move his ship over here to the Presidio, but he wrote that it wasn't as good an anchorage over here by the Presidio. Now you see this big body of water to the south of the Presidio anchorage. That was actually a huge marsh. And I will tell you more about that in a minute, but it shows up really, really clearly on here, even while a lot of things are a little bit rough, like Telegraph Hill. It's a little unclear, the shape and the positioning of Telegraph Hill on here, and the shoreline gets a little cattywampus, but it's pretty close. Okay, then we look at the ones that are done with modern survey techniques, relatively modern survey techniques. Of course, today surveying is mostly done with LiDAR and electronics, but at the time that the U.S. Coast Survey was created in the 1850s, they did a series in the coastal areas, not the inland areas, which is why this map fades out on the left. And you can see this is Telegraph Hill up here at the top with all those contour lines looping around it, and this area that's built up is where we are now, where the bay, that is Yerba Buena Cove, was, and this little bit of Yerba Buena Cove was still there. You can see Washerwoman's Lagoon and a row of other little lagoons here in the upper left. Now, one of the things that's not too visible here is where they got their water. You can, of course, there were places where they got water because you can't survive without water. But where were they? Well, let's move in and take a look at some of the places where people got water. Now, this is one that I have to tell you is most mysterious. This is an 1847 survey map from the Presidio at a time when contour lines were barely invented and not being used in a way that we use them today. People were just sort of experimenting, trying to figure it out. This is Fort Point up here at the top, and you can even see the fort. And then down here, there's this oddly shaped, almost fishtail on the north end of it, and it says, if you look closely, it says freshwater pond. Now, it's called Pozo de los Marineros, which means sailor's well or mariner's well. And so we know that at some point, some Spanish-speaking people were telling other people on shipboard, you just need to go in through the Golden Gate there. It wasn't called the Golden Gate yet. You just need to go in through there, and first thing on the right, there's a fresh water source. You can get water there. Otherwise, it wouldn't be marked Pozo de los Marineros on maps. At least that's the theory. But we don't have a lot of information, and I haven't been able to come across anything saying, oh, we specifically went and got water at this location. But it is part of this broader marsh. You see further to the south here, you see more marshland, and that broad marsh that was drawn in Vancouver's drawing actually included a freshwater area. We do know that for sure, and it was fed by creeks coming down the hill from the areas that are now the viewpoints over Crissy Field. Okay, let's zoom out so we can move to the next slide. And now this one that's not good. I think this is, there we go. This one shows big marshes down here in Mission Bay, and it also shows contour lines with numbers next to them when they were still, once again, they were still figuring out how contour lines work. But one of the things that's most interesting here is, if you know how to read contour lines, you can see dimly these very sharp U-shaped lines here in the bottom left corner. That was a deep gully. At the opening of the gully, it was 100 feet above sea level, and at the top of the gully, it was 180 feet above sea level. Actually 200 by some of these lines. So it was quite a deep gully and very narrow, about a block wide, less than a block wide. And that is located where the cable car powerhouse is today. And that got filled in really early. Before the 1857 map was created, it got filled in, and whatever water source was coming out of that gully, because there had to have been a significant spring to make that gully, had been, by that time, sequestered by someone who was taking the water to sell it. Now, the people who took that water actually joined together with other water sources and other people and created the first water company that became San Francisco's public water system. So when the water department, when the San Francisco city of San Francisco took over water, the city took it from the Spring Valley Waterworks, which had been Spring Valley Water Company, and the Spring Valley Water Company, those were the people who capitalized on that spring. Now, there's another mystery here that would be fun to solve, which is the name of Spring Valley. How many of you heard the name Spring Valley Water Company or Spring Valley Water Works? Quite a few of you. So it's a pretty well-known thing. In fact, if you go down the street, you're as likely as not on a wander through San Francisco for an hour, if you're looking, to see a cover on some part of the infrastructure, one of those little circular metal covers on the street, say SVWW or SVWC for Spring Valley Water Company. They're still around. The infrastructure is still part of our system, but we don't really know for sure where Spring Valley was. Lots of people believe that this gully I'm talking about, that came right down into Chinatown and flowed into that saltwater lagoon at Jackson and Montgomery, that was Spring Valley. There are others who believe, and I've got to say they're all dead, except for me. There are others who believe, or believed when they wrote about it in the paper many, many decades ago, that the name Spring Valley came from what we now call Cow Hollow, which also had a lot of springs, and the people who formed the company were from or lived in that valley. That what they had in common was they all were people from Cow Hollow area. So the Spring Valley School could be a hint. That used to be in Chinatown, and now it's over in Cow Valley, so that doesn't help. We don't really know for sure. And there are references to both. When you look at this new angle with the rain coming in and the modeling that Alan Zimmerman did, you can see really clearly The line right here is coming out of the spring. That was that deep gully at Washington and Clay, and at Mason and Clay. The cable car powerhouse was right there where the arrow is pointing. So it curved around to the north and then back to the south and hit the bay right there where the Jackson and Montgomery Lagoon is located. This is the map that was overlaid in Alan's animation there, and you can see, unlike on the other map I showed you, you can see that gully with the street grid. There it is. So this is Mason Street, this is Clay Street, this is Washington Street, and the gully started right there behind the community center where the basketball courts are. This corner is where the cable car powerhouse is, and it flowed around to the north and then into the bay right here. So, right here. You can see this little funny dotted line. That's the lagoon. Okay. Now, these function better. I think it's this zooming that's causing me a problem. When I zoom out, I sometimes zoom out of the program. Here's a photo taken of Washerwoman's Lagoon. That's this pool of water right here, which was also a source of water for people who were doing laundry and who needed water for their gardens, for their cows, for drinking, and so on. But the washing was mostly done at North Beach before the city expanded to Washerwoman's Lagoon. So actually, North Beach used to be called Washerwoman's Bay. And that's because there were freshwater pools on the sand at North Beach as well, especially during wet periods. And it happens to be, just by coincidence, that one of the wettest periods in the history of San Francisco as a named city was the first decade. So there was quite a lot of water flowing out and forming pools, freshwater pools on the beach at Washerwoman's Bay, i.e. North Beach. Then they moved the name, along with the washing, over here to Washerwoman's Lagoon. And you can see this open sandy area behind it. And there's a little lagoon you can not really see here. There's some on both sides that I mentioned in that other picture, but I'll get to them here, where a map of who owned what property includes all of those. Now this is where it says Lobos Square. All this area was sand. And Alcatraz Square, those have been renamed or never happened like that. Some of those were just plans. Of course, they were planning, because in any boom town you do this. You plan for what you're going to do to make a lot of money. And you draw most of your maps not to record what's there, but record what you're dreaming of. So that's what this map shows, in addition to who has claims or stakes on the land. All these names in different colors show that. But you see the row of little lagoons. That's because the water coming down out of Cow Hollow, i.e. Spring Valley, would back up when it hit the sand dunes. It couldn't soak into the sand the moment it got there, so it would form pools and percolate into the sand over time. When Captain Juan Bautista de Anza first came to San Francisco to pick a site for the mission and for the Presidio, he saw Washerwoman's Lagoon and he said, great, nice source of water, but bad location, because there's no soil that we can use gravity feed from there to make farms. It's just sand downhill from there. So that's why he went traipsing across the sand dunes in the other direction, all the way to DuBose Park, where he found water coming out of the dunes on that side. Now we have, two kinds of formations here, the water going into the dunes, getting backed up as it enters the dunes, and then you have creeks where water is draining out of the dunes in places. So at DuBose Park, there were creeks from what we now know as the Lower Haight, that area, which included the Panhandle area and even Coal Valley water draining out of the dunes. And he said, this is enough water draining out of the dunes that we could even run a water wheel. So this is a perfect place to put the mission. And of course you need water for the mission, because the mission is essentially, it's a farm. It's a production facility for food for the soldiers. So the mission is going to set up with basically a slave culture to get to enslave Indians to grow the food for the soldiers. And lest you think I'm exaggerating and making some very dramatic terminology here, take a look at the murals in the Presidio and you'll see just exactly what it was like, with the Indians being herded around with military folks watching over them and carrying guns and making sure that they did their work. It was really a slave culture. Okay, let's see. Zoom out without zooming out too far and go to the next slide. Sorry about this technical thing. This is not my computer, so I don't know. Come on. There it is. Oh, it took a while to load because it's a really big file. So this is an 1869 map, the first carefully done map of what was there, not of dreams, what could be there, that the Coast Survey did, covering the entire city. They finally realized, okay, for strategic reasons, we don't just need the coast, we don't just need the harbor, we need the whole city. So they did a contour map of the entire city, and we'll zoom in to the part that's San Francisco and immediately see in every location where there was a creek coming out of the hills, there were houses that were, or buildings that were marked on the map that were going to be for the purpose of exploiting that creek, that water system. The almshouse was at the top of a set of creeks that's near Laguna Honda. That's, almshouse is now Laguna Honda Hospital. Even if you go way down here south into the part of the city where it was considered way out in the country, there were people who were setting up by the water. This is Glen Canyon, and there are these houses, of course, they're next to the water. This is where there's a big spring today. You may even have noticed as you come down O'Shaughnessy Boulevard, there's this big horseshoe curve that's often wet, and you have to go really carefully if you're a motorcyclist. And sure enough, right there where it's now the dead end of Bosworth Street, where it turns to O'Shaughnessy, there are some buildings. And you can find that throughout the city, that wherever there are springs, there are buildings that were positioned to take advantage of the water, or canals that were built, irrigation ditches, channels, and so forth that were built. Here's one of my favorites. This is Visitation Valley, and here's a farm, a big square fence outlining the farm, and here's some creeks coming off of the shoulder of the Southern Hills, which is part of San Bruno Mountain. And the creek was diverted right here at their property line. It was diverted, instead of just going across their property and flowing out Visitation Valley into the water, into the bay, it was diverted into a ditch that went the border of their property, of this property, into this other property, so that because they had somehow cornered or sequestered the water rights. And people were doing this everywhere. Like, how can I control the water that trickles out here and there? And it trickled out much more then than it does now. Not just because it was a very wet period, but also because it was a less paved period. So now the pavement diverts, the rooftops, the sidewalks, everything diverts the water directly into the sewer. By design, the sewers get flushed out. The wastewater gets flushed out by the rains. And not everybody in the world has this kind of a system. We're very special. We have one of these old systems that's a combined wastewater and stormwater system, where they need, in the flatlands, to keep it from building up during the dry season, it being poop. They need the rains and the springs to flush the system out, the springs to flush the system out year round. This is one of my laments about San Francisco. It turns out that for many, many decades, the Department of Building Inspection had rules that the moment that you find water while doing any kind of construction project, you had to divert it into the sewer. And that was to make this system work, to keep the system flushed, even during the dry season. Well, there was no rule about keeping track of these diversions. So there are springs all over the city that we don't know exist, because the work was done without any kind of a record being kept. And those of us who want to know are constantly talking to the wastewater folks in the city to try to figure out, what's the flow like at 3 a.m. in this section of the sewer? Because that helps it's another clue. Now here's something that'll give us another nice drawing by Emily Underwood that gives us a sense of what was flowing through San Francisco before urbanization. I don't like to say originally because water changes all the time and land changes all the time. There's no original when it comes to water, but before urbanization, or when the Spaniards arrived, you might say. Preseta Creek was this creek that flowed next to Bernal Hill into a marsh to the east of Bernal Hill that is now a kind of buckling warehouse district, and it's buckling because it used to be a marsh. Bayshore Boulevard is shown here along the side. It wasn't called Bayshore Boulevard at that point, but it was named that because the marsh was considered part of the bay. Preseta Park still exists, and this is an 1869 image, or that is, I drew this I worked with Emily to draw this from the 1869 map. So you can see where a creek from Tiffany Street comes in and joins in. This is a little bit, besides being bright blue, and of course water isn't bright blue except on maps and drawings, it's also a little bit wrong in that there was a ditch that went alongside for many, many years that moved water from way up here in Noe Valley out onto a truck farming area that was in the Mission District. So there wasn't very much water in the creek. And that's another problem for those of us trying to figure out the past. The creeks don't even show up on a lot of maps. Sometimes it's because people didn't want to brag about the creeks, thinking, oh, that's going to trouble people, so we don't want people to think about water. Water could damage your property. No, a lot of it was just because the creeks were gone. They had been diverted for sale, for use, for farming, whatever. This street was called Serpentine Avenue because it was right along the bank of the creek, and it was a very windy street. And this street was called Preseta Avenue because it was right along Preseta Creek. Preseta is a word that means weir, meaning a water diverter. And this is what they found. This is a drawing of the kind of weir they would have found. The Spanish came along and disrupted the systems that the Alamu, which are the Native American people that lived in what's now San Francisco, had built in the creek to get fish. And it was a normal practice throughout Central and Northern California to build these weirs and have baskets to catch the fish. So Preseta is named for one of these weirs. Now this, I did not realize this was in here, but this is North Beach after a lot of industrialization, but it shows the two pools. It shows two pools that were created by this sandbar being enhanced for the warehouse. But this is what was Washerwoman's Bay. Okay, now there are lots of other places that had very localized supplies of water. For example, this, I don't know how many of you recognize this. This is a very specific location that it would be pretty remarkable if So St. Mary of the Virgin Church on Union and Steiner has this in their courtyard, and it's a spring. This is a nozzle where all the water that collects in the foundation of the building pours into this pool and sometimes overflows into the plaza. That's their courtyard when it's been when there's a lot of water. Now, it's not always true that springs run stronger after rains, but if you have a long stretch of 2 or 3 years with more rain, there will usually be more spring water. That's another reason that we don't have as many, we wouldn't have as many springs around here, even if nobody had ever built a city here. It's because the weather has not been as wet. But this is a beautiful drawing I wanted to share with you, but it's an example of a much more localized source of water. Now, one thing that I kind of elided when I talked about all these different sources that people go to for their water was Sausalito. Now, this picture doesn't show Sausalito, but let me talk about Sausalito. Sausalito, like Pozo de los Marineros on the south side of the Golden Gate, Sausalito was on the north side, but it was a much safer place to put your ship while you were waiting to get water. So all of the ship guidebooks, I guess you'd call them, talked about Sausalito as the place to go and get your water. And San Francisco was known as the place you could go where there was no water supply. You couldn't expect anybody to give, you could get wood on what was called Wood Island, which is now called Angel Island, but you couldn't get water unless you went to Sausalito. And so really both wood and water were outside the city proper. Now, when they did set up a system for collecting water for a large-scale commercial use, this was the first reservoir of any significance that was built in. This is Russian Hill. So you can see this kind of rectilinear pattern. That's because they did just built this. There's a tennis court on top of it today. The reservoir is still there and still being used up on top of Russian Hill. This is Black Point, where the water was deep enough for a ship to come close to shore that I mentioned to you. And you can see along the face of Black Point, there's an aqueduct known as a flume. It's a water conduit made out of wood that brought water to a pumping station down here at the base of the hill that pumped up to that reservoir. And then that reservoir fed water into the area here where we are today, this whole valley that we think of essentially as North Beach and Chinatown and the financial district. All of that could be reached by gravity once it had been pumped up to that reservoir. Here's a second reservoir that was built further down the hill. This is the Francisco Reservoir. That first one, by the way, was up at Lombard and Hyde. This is at Francisco and Hyde. And the Francisco Reservoir, this is on one of the Sanborn fire maps. It was up against the hillside in a way where they didn't make it rectangular because the hillside bedrock made it hard to cut in, so they just made it this funny shape. And here's more of that flume. The flume went, we're going to trace the flume all the way back to the water source. This is the first attempt to bring water from far away. And this is going along northwards from approximately Baker Beach, is where the photographer was standing above Baker Beach. And this is Fort Point up here. So this flume went all the way up and around Fort Point and all the way over to Russian Hill. And if you follow it further upstream, this is what you find. This is a much more recent photo. This is from the 1930s, actually from 1929. And this is Mountain Lake. That was the source of water for that flume. The water in Mountain Lake in the Presidio soaked into the sand here on the Richmond District side, went around a bedrock outcrop that nobody knew existed until about 3 years ago. Everybody thought the water soaked through the right here on the west side of Mountain Lake, but it actually went into Lobos Creek and then into some pipes that fed that flume. Now this picture might look really odd to you because it doesn't have Highway 1. This is right before they cut Mountain Lake in half. Lake Street is right here, named after the lake, Mountain Lake, of course. And half of it, this west half of it, was filled in for Highway 1 and a big tunnel entrance put in right here. So this is an aerial photo right before all that was done. Now the golf course was there. What they did actually was they didn't tunnel through the golf course. That golf course is just a vast sand dune. What they did was they cut a trench into the sand dune. They put a half pipe of concrete and then they buried it over with sand again and put the golf course back on top. So that tunnel it wasn't tunneled. The tunnel wasn't tunneled. Now there was also water being collected on the slopes of Twin Peaks. This was pumped up from Glen Park over Noe Valley. And this was a project that was done in 1891. So we're getting further along into the development of the city. Oops. Actually, we'll get back to Noe Valley in a minute. This is another piece. This is the photo of that same flume at Black Point with a ship anchored there, but taken from the other direction in a stereograph form, where if you put on the right glasses, you can, or twiddle your eyes just right, you can see it 3D. So this one, we're going to skip that slide, but that slide showed that there was a tunnel being built from Mountain Lake, that you can see a line, a diagonal line right here from Mountain Lake, and that tunnel was built to get the water, instead of using a flume going around, to get the water more directly through the hills. That map showed it, but you have to take my word for it. They built the tunnel, they mapped it out, and it's still there, but it was forgotten for years and years, and recently the archaeologists at the Presidio found it again. It never was used, never was used. It's just amazing. So this map shows, this is an 1870 map, and it shows the even more extreme efforts to get water in from San Mateo County. This is the first time in 1862, was the first time that water was brought in from outside San Francisco by aqueduct. And this, you can see this line, this wiggly line that goes way out in the Sunset District to stay gravity fed along the hills. It's all gravity fed from San Mateo County, and it goes into this pool, natural pool, that got fortified to be a reservoir, and that's Laguna Honda. Now, Laguna Honda Reservoir still exists today, but it's abandoned, and it doesn't have as much water in it as it used to. From there, the water used to go through a pipe that went under Haight Street all the way, this is all by gravity, no pumps, all the way to the reservoir at what now is Mint Hill, at Buchanan and Market. So this same flume delivered water. Of course, it joined in with the local water from these creeks you see next to the almshouse, next to Laguna Honda, and one of those creeks is still flowing today. But it also, but most of it was from Pilarcitos Creek on Montera Mountain, and that water helped to create Horner's Addition, which is Noe Valley, and the area around Eureka Valley was all developed. And even the Mission District itself was developed because of this flume coming in 1862. It was, yes?
So thinking about the bicycle. So there's a downhill route from San Mateo County all the way to Laguna Honda.
With the flume, they crossed any place where there was a gully, they built a bridge over it, so the flume would go on beams and stilts across the valleys and then follow the contours of the hills. If that flume still existed, yes, you could go downhill all the way from the tunnel that they drilled through the shoulder of Montera Mountain and go down, but you can't. That's one of the fun things about flumes is, you know, you can actually go into the Sierra today and there are flumes that were used for floating logs or that are used for getting irrigation water to the flatlands. And you can actually get in the water and float all the way down gradual slope, mile after mile after mile. And you could do that with a bicycle if that flume were still there, but instead there are all these gullies intervening. Now this map, yeah, this map is interesting to me in another way, which is this Langley map, which is a commercial map, and you can see on the right here, there's a lot of dreams there where the bay is filled in with streets and neighborhoods that never got built. But right down here, where Glen Park is, Glen Canyon is, there it is, Islay Creek. Now, a lot of people think Islais, which is how it's spelled today, is pronounced Islis, Islayas, Islias. There are 1,000 different versions of it, and I never argue with people. You can say it however you want, but it's probably named after the Islay cherry, which was a Salinian word from a Native American group near Salinas, and here it's codified in its pronunciation before it was Frenchified into Islais. So Islay Creek is what I always call it. This is not the only map that shows it spelled that way, just in case you were thinking this might be an outlier. Okay, so then the flume. What's that?
Could you try full screen again?
Oh, good idea. This is the fortified reservoir. This is actually a picture when they were rebuilding it in 1903. But in 1862, they put in these sideways arches. This is now Laguna Honda Boulevard. Laguna Honda Hospital is at the far end here. And 8th Avenue is at the top of this sandy dune here. This is the structure of Laguna Honda Reservoir when it was in full use. And this is an Emily Underwood redrawing, to make it clearer, of a survey done by Herman Schussler, the city's earliest polymath water engineer who had his hands in everything. He even was responsible for sleuthing out the location of the Broderick Terry duel. And I mean, he had his hands on everything. He was an interesting guy. But he shows where the mountain lake water came from, and it came from the same valley as Laguna Honda and percolated through the dunes of Golden Gate Park. And he has all these wells that he drilled to find out exactly where the water was going. Now this is a mansion you may have seen. Here's one view of it right after it was built, and you can see a clue to this mansion down here in the bottom right where there's a vast amount of water coming out of a hose. This was Baron Jost's mansion, which is still there, divided up into 16 apartments at Caselli and Douglas. And Jost was one of these figures who I could tell stories. I won't bother to go into detail about the guy, but he was trying to make it in the water business in the 1890s, and he built a whole empire that was challenging various people's claims to water in Glen Park. And in particular, oh wait, I'm getting this story backwards, and I erase that. It wasn't Baron Jost's mansion. It was Nobby Clark's mansion, Alfred Clark's mansion, and he was competing with Baron Jost, who lived right behind this mansion, for water control of the area. So Baron Jost had a water company that was taking all the water from the top of Eureka Valley and the top of Coal Valley and selling it. And Baron Jost, Nobby Clark was taking water from Glen Park, and Jost had already said that was his water, so they had this big battle very publicly over water in the early 1890s. I'm sorry for getting Clark and Jost mixed up, but in my head, it's pretty clear because Nobby Clark was not celebrated. He was not, part of the reason he was not celebrated publicly was because when he built this mansion, that kind of showed off his way of being snarky and in your face about his money, which was probably not gathered in a very kosher way. So whereas Jost was celebrated as somebody who brought the electric railroad and all kinds of benefits to the city. So the two of them were in a feud, very close proximity to each other. This is in Glen Canyon where water was being exploited, and this is called Bethlehem Spring, with workers digging out a formation or a pool around the spring to try to pump water from there to Noe Valley. And it was pumped to these tanks in Stanford Heights, as well as the tanks above Noe Valley that you saw before. This is Nobby Clark, looking Nobby, with his pipe, standing by a pool of water that's not very big in Glen Canyon, the opening day of his waterworks. And he hired a photographer. This is 1891. He hired a photographer to take lots of pictures, but those pictures have been mostly hidden away. A few people have copies of them, but I was very happy to find some of the originals in the California Historical Society and try to figure out where these dams were. I never figured out precisely, but there were two dams in Glen Canyon that he grabbed the water and tried to pump it over to Noe Valley, or did pump it for a short time over to Noe Valley to sell. Okay, so what I think is happening is, there we go. Some of these slides got a little bit out of order because of the switch from a Mac to a Windows, but anyway, that's the mansion. This is another scheme to bring water from far away. This is bringing water from Alameda Creek, and this is the east end of the aqueduct that goes underneath the bay. There's a water temple at each end of the aqueduct. The Pulgas Water Temple is at the west end, and this is the Sinol Temple at the east end. The water comes down through Pleasanton and comes into Niles Canyon, and there's an aqueduct in Niles Canyon that's called the Niles Canyon Sidewalk because it's concrete. It's a pretty interesting setup, but we still get lots of water from Alameda Creek. What you think of as your Hetch Hetchy water system is a mixture of a lot of things, including a lot of water from Alameda Creek. And here is the most recent picture I have, that is to say, we're at the end of the lineage of water snarfing that I'm going to introduce you to. This is the very end stages of the Sunset District being filled in with houses. This is the the northern half of Sunset Reservoir. The southern half of Sunset Reservoir had not yet been built. Now, not only are there two halves filling up a much larger space, but there are solar panels on top. And it's a very modern structure that's been rebuilt quite recently. But you can actually see that unlike most of the Sunset District, this spot actually had a spring. The rest of the Sunset District had open dunes, shifting sands, and very, very few water sources that were reliable water sources. But there was an actual spring right here that you can see the gullies created by it over the course of hundreds, thousands of years. The water from the spring washed the sand out of this area and kept vegetation growing there.
Y'all be sure to identify that building in the top right. Right above it.
Yeah.
Lincoln High School.
People waving their hands. Waving at your old alma mater. So that brings me to my last slide, which is my map. As or a version of my map. I have many versions of my map about water history of San Francisco. And this one is my map showing where gullies were and which direction water flowed in them. For example, you can see here Russian Hill with water flowing down the west side in these gullies and down the east side in these gullies, and the ridge going through here, through the middle right here. I'm trying to put together an interactive version of my map, and this is what you're seeing here is a version of that that'll be online, and you can poke around and zoom in and out and click on things to see what they are and where they flowed. And this has been years of pressure on me to create an interactive online version of my map, because I've always been a print media guy, and I've always made posters and documents on paper, or in the case of what you see hanging here from the projection screen on polyester cloth, which is a shower curtain version of the map. And this is my latest. I haven't been really putting the word out much, but I do have, I've been experimenting with different colors of shower curtains for my map. So it is not, by the way, it might be printed on a shower curtain, but it is not, make no mistake, a shower curtain. It's a piece of art. If you knew how much I went through to create each one of these by hand. And luckily I have a good friend, Bill Stender, who runs SF Landmark Sign Company, that he's the only person with a large-scale cloth printing system in the whole city. So I have access to that, and he lets me print these there, and it's quite a process. So I'm very pleased to have something like this, because with my 2-foot by 2-foot posters of the city, even, okay, forget about the online zooming stuff. If you really want to see detail, you need something big. 2-foot by 2-foot is not enough. So I thought, where do people have space in their house that they could, nobody has a 6-foot wall that's just sitting empty waiting for my map. But people, 6-foot shower curtain, so there you go.
Joel, excuse me, I just want to ask, I do have Joel's map shower curtain in my house, and I love it. I've got the one that it's not like so big, it's gotta be all over it. Anyway, it will match any decor.
Thank you for that plug, Lana. So I'd be very happy to take questions, and also I'm happy to talk about other parts of the city, other aspects of the city that don't have to do with original or early water sources for the growing of the urban structure that I've focused on during this talk. We can focus on whatever you want, even if it doesn't have to do with water and you just want to talk about the hills and the landforms, other natural history or cultural history stuff, because it's all tied together. That's what excites me about it, is that the water and the landforms, that's what determine what we see in the city today. And if you have the right detective brain, the right sleuthing attitude, you can actually look at the landscape in a very urbanized place like this, like where we are right now, and find all these great clues about the landform that was here, Spring Street and the gullies and so on.
Because we're going to record this for YouTube.
Is that on?
We ask that you,
Is that on?
that's on.
Okay.
We ask that you use the microphone to ask your question.
I don't think it's on either. I think that it would be coming out of those speakers if it was on. Oh, it is, okay.
So,
Okay, now it's on for sure.
thank you.
So where did the water go for DuBose Park?
Where did the water go for DuBose Park? So there was a creek that flowed from a spot approximately where DuBose and Sanchez is today, where DuBose Park Cafe is today, in an arc around the hill that used to exist there. Right now, the only remnant of it is Mint Hill, but it used to extend all the way to 15th Street, and it would arc around that hill. And in fact, when it curved back northeast again at about Guerrero and 14th, somewhere right about there was the only known waterfall in San Francisco. And I'm talking about waterfall that was there before we created, Huntington Falls in Stowe Lake and all that kind of thing.
Not Huntington Falls, Strawberry Hill.
Right. So the water from that waterfall was written about by Font in his diary when he was on the Anza expedition. The water flowed east from there through what was for a time Woodward Gardens, and Woodward used a lot of that water. And then it flowed into Mission Creek at a spot that actually for a long time was named Creek Street, which today is called Erie Street, and it's the tiny little alley across Folsom Street from Rainbow Grocery. So right at Folsom and Creek Street, underneath the Central Freeway, that is where that creek joined Mission Creek and flowed to the bay. But it was one of those creeks that didn't actually flow for very long, because within days of the Padres showing up and setting up the mission, they realized they needed this water source to be used efficiently in irrigation ditches into their farm fields, not flowing into this creek bed. So that creek bed was empty for years and years and not on most maps. Angus?
Back in the 1850s, and probably longer, the main newspaper of San Francisco, the Daily Alta California, had offices overlooking Portsmouth Square. And they regularly ridiculed the state of the city's Central Park, but they kept mentioning over and over attempts, some successful, some unsuccessful, of digging an artesian well in Portsmouth Square. Were they dreaming, or could it have been one of the streams you mentioned?
They were not dreaming. If you actually dig a well along the shoreline anywhere in San Francisco, it might or might not be artesian, which means that water pressure pushes the water up to the top and you don't have to pump the water out. But you definitely would get fresh water, even right next to the shore, anywhere along the shores of San Francisco. And that spot was right on the shore at the time. Like even out at the beach where they put in the windmills, the Murphy and the Queen Wilhelmina windmills are very close to the beach. Fresh water, those wells, those windmills were pumping, and the electric pumps that are there now are pumping fresh water out, because there's so much water that rains onto the city and percolates through the soils and pushes outwards in all directions, that it keeps, should I say it, it keeps the salt water at bay. Grown. So yes, it would have worked. And whether they would have had a water war on their hands, that's a different question, because somebody would have said, oh, wait, you're removing some of the supply from somewhere that they wanted water to be.
Question?
So does Islay Creek run through Glen Canyon?
Yeah, now Islay Creek is the name that's given to both branches, the Glen Canyon branch and the Cayuga branch that came up from the south. Part of the Cayuga branch was called West End Creek, but many maps label from about where Balboa High School is north, label that as Islay Creek as well. And then they joined together right below Glen Canyon, and it flowed out through Islay Marsh, which is the area east of Bernal Hill.
So I don't understand when you say, I mean, obviously a lot of that creek has been covered up now, right? So, but,
Yeah.
but you can't see the origins of it.
You can
up
see
in Glen Canyon and then obviously down at Islay Creek Lagoon or the.
Yeah,
So
it's been mostly
what's in
covered.
between? You're saying it doesn't exist in between anymore?
No,
or?
I'm saying that it's mixed in with wastewater. It's not. It's just flowing in the sewer. It's not a freshwater creek flowing underground. It's a sewer. In fact, even if you walk through the natural area of Glen Park today, you'll see sewer covers access covers as you go along the trails, because they put a sewer through the park there that brings wastewater from the hillsides above, Turquoise Way and up by the Safeway there at the top of the hill. The sewer comes down through there, so the fresh water that's in the surface creek you see in the park goes underground right by the community center, right by Glen Park ball fields there, and immediately joins in with that sewer and becomes a sewer. It's not a creek flowing underground. It's a creek flowing in the sewer. It's not just covered, it's entirely surrounded, top and bottom, with this sewer.
And then Mission Creek, that originates up around Clayton Street or up that way? Or?
Well, Mission Creek itself was a misnomer for a tidal lagoon that came in and out with the tides, that went to Folsom and 20th, was the furthest extreme in that the tides reached. And there were some places about 18th and Mission, 18th and Valencia, where at king tides it would make it all the way to 18th and Valencia as well. So it was like a tidal slosh that at very low tides would be mud with fresh water going through it in a flow from the sources that were fresh if they were not being sequestered into tanks and sold. In other words, there was a trickle of fresh water in this tidal thing called Mission Creek. But when you say Clayton...
Well, actually, I meant 18th Street.
Okay, yeah.
Going up to Clayton, but yeah.
Yeah, so 18th Street had irrigation ditches that moved the water from what's now the area around Corona Heights and Castro Street, moved that into farmlands that were, or farm fields that were at the top of the valley there. And then, say, around Diamond and 18th. And then the creek bed gathered together a lot of water from Eureka Valley. There were a lot of little streams that came down 18th Street. Whether they were in the early days being used in the farms or in the later days going into the sewers underneath 18th Street, it was the main tributary of fresh water to Mission Creek. But it wasn't Mission Creek itself, because Mission Creek wasn't a creek, it was a tidal inlet. And one of the fun things about Mission Creek is that if you picture, this is Mission Creek right here, if you picture that this is a tidal inlet and that these marshlands were a wider part of the creek at one time, maybe 10,000 years ago, this whole valley that's fairly flat where the Mission District is, was all a tidal lagoon, and it gradually filled in to what we had in the 1700s, a much narrower thing that looked like a creek with some marshes along it. But all these marshes were part of the tidal inlet, and all of this was a tidal inlet. way out to the wider zone that we now see as a flat mission district. And this was just, it wasn't a creek, it was just a shrunk down version of that tidal inlet that happened over the last 15,000 years.
We have a question here.
Thank you. Do you have an opinion when, I guess, the Spaniards came and kind of, quote, discovered the area? Like other parts of San Francisco Bay, there's small streams that, salmon would sort of go to, and I guess the natives would utilize them. San Francisco ever have anything like that, or was...
There's no real information about salmon in San Francisco proper. There was no culture of salmon that we know of, but we know very little about the details of the culture of the Yelamu because, in fact, the culture was stomped on, obliterated, wiped out so quickly, and in fact, the people who were taken into the mission to work in the mission and to be converted were then sent back out again to try to fetch other Indians from other parts of the Bay Area for conversions, for additional conversions, because they were running out of people, because people were dying so fast. And then keep in mind that 200 years before the Spanish arrived here, the diseases arrived here. When the Spanish were in South America, people were already getting sick. The diseases traveled across the landscape. People were already getting sick in North America from European diseases. And it's only based on various kinds of estimates, and nobody knows for sure, but it's pretty likely that most of the cultural changes that happened, or I should say that a vast number of cultural changes happened in what people ate and how people lived during the course of the 1500s and 1600s before there were any records that we know of telling. So there might have been salmon-based cultures in this area, but there's no evidence of it. I don't think in San Francisco proper that there were any salmon-based cultures.
We got a question from the chat online.
Nice.
The question from the chat online asks, Test. Okay. The question from online asks about the salt water, why the salt water was being taken, and why were they taking salt water from near Baker Beach?
Okay, salt water being taken. I'm not sure what that refers to. There were some swimming pools in the city in clubs that, membership clubs where people were taking salt water, pumping it to various places to swim in because salt is an antibacterial agent and they weren't using chlorine. But I'm not sure if that's what they're referring to. And it wasn't Baker Beach that I know of where salt water was pumped for that purpose. It was out by the end of Balboa, just south of the Cliff House. So, and by the way, that saltwater reservoir was where the Trader Joe is today at Masonic and Geary.
Took my head.
So I'm not sure if that's what they meant.
Let me add one thing. I was teaching in Balboa High School in 1968, 69, and we had a pump failure. Now, remember Balboa High School is on Cayuga Creek. Anyway, pump failure, school started, water up 6 feet in the cafeteria.
Yeah.
It was a rainy winter as
That's
well.
the biggest, the area around Balboa High School is the biggest watershed of San Francisco, so that doesn't surprise me. The Southern Hills, the San Bruno Mountain proper, all the way up Glen Canyon and over to Mount St. Joseph's, all that area funneled into that valley where Cayuga is. And by the way, Cayuga, the old name for Cayuga Street was Springdale. And in 1895, Springdale Street was named. The previous name for the street before 1895 was Islay Street. So it was very well recognized in the early days that it was following the creek or that it was at the creek. Yes?
Maybe I missed it, but have you written a book about all this?
You didn't miss it. I'm a slowpoke. The book is very.
You are going to write one, right?
Yeah, the book that goes with this map and with this research is something I've been working on and off for the last few years, and I would say much more on right now than before.
I'd buy it.
The process has been wonderful, but it turns out that writing about the water of the entire city is biting off a pretty big chunk to chew on. So yeah, it's been a slow and interesting process, and the book is in the works. Thanks. Oh, and I should tell you the name of the book, Seep City Waterlog.
Joel, how did Lake Merced fit into all of this?
Lake Merced, which is the largest body of water in San Francisco today, in the southwest corner of the city, Lake Merced was fed by lots of different creeks, and it was far enough away from the areas that were developed early on that it was not obliterated by the traditions of obliteration that affected the northeastern and eastern parts of the city so much. And by the time that area was developed, there had an ethic of preserving some natural areas had developed. But it was used as a backup water source by the Spring Valley Water Company, and they built a dam where it used to be a creek flowing to the ocean from Lake Merced. So all the creeks that fed Lake Merced, that was a significant amount of water. It had to go somewhere. It wasn't all just soaking into the sand. And you can still today see the creek bed, the gully that the creek used to flow in to get to the ocean. It still has water in it, or again has water in it. It's the little artificial creek that's created by pumps next to the puffer train in the zoo. And it flows, there's a pool at one end and a pool at the other end, and the train flows alongside, and the water gets pumped from the western pool to the eastern pool, and then it flows through the creek, and that's the gully that was the creek bed.
Choo-choo. Yeah, you mentioned a dam, which triggered a memory in my head that back in the 20s, the city's chief engineer, O'Shaughnessy, wanted to dam Islay Creek in Glen Canyon and have, for whatever purpose, water, firefighting, emergency earthquake protection. But they actually did begin construction, but obviously they didn't finish construction.
Yeah, I've seen a number of maps of where the dam was going to be and what section of the canyon would be obliterated by that, but it didn't happen except on paper and in any significant way anyway. And a lot of other things were attempted in Glen Canyon as well that never got very far. Like, did you know that Grandview, which is a street, a north-south street at the top of Noe Valley, at the west side of Noe Valley, was supposed to meet 30th Street in Glen Canyon. So these streets were going to be cut through and the hilltops were going to be chopped off and everything was going to be leveled enough to put streets through, and all kinds of things were partly done or not done or planned out, and Glen Canyon had dodged it all somehow. It's a pretty good landscape survivor. In fact, Lobos Creek, which flows out at Baker Beach, and Islay Creek and Glen Canyon are the celebrated areas where we see water today. But there are new efforts, including in the Presidio, lots of great new efforts in the Presidio and a few places else in the city where surface water is being daylighted, that is created on the surface where it had been in a culvert or in a sewer. And the Presidio is easy because they didn't have a sewage mix in there when they undergrounded the creeks, when they put them into culverts. But the rest of the city is much more complicated to do that. So there are they're bending a few rules if you're talking about recreating a creek at Yosemite Creek at McLaren Park. That's what the city is working on doing, but it's not going to be the same creek. It's not going to follow the same route. It's going to go around the University Mound Reservoir site instead of through the reservoir site, and it's going to go around the playing fields. So the creek will have right angles in it and be a very urban water feature. But thanks for bringing that up. Glen Canyon is definitely a famous place for going to see water flowing on the surface.
I think it's time to raise your hands and clap your hands, because anything that Joel does is fabulous. All right. See you next week.